Grace had always been known in the mansion as the quiet maid, who never spoke unless spoken to, the one who walked softly, kept her head down, and never caused any trouble, but behind those tired eyes was a heart that carried the weight of 1,000 worries. And tonight, as the rain tapped against the tall glass windows of the billionaire Richard's estate, she felt the kind of fear that makes a person's hands tremble uncontrollably. For she had made a decision that would change not only her life but the lives of everyone in the house. Earlier that day, while dusting the shelves in Richard's office, she had overheard a hushed conversation between the family doctor and one of Richard's assistants, their words falling like sharp blades into her heart as they spoke about Daniel, Richard's only son, who had grown weaker with each passing week, his small frame losing strength, his face pale like paper, and the doctor's voice heavy with the truth that unless Daniel received a special surgery very soon, he would not survive, the words echoing in her ears long after the office had fallen silent. And in that moment, Grace knew she could not stand by and watch the boy's life slip away. Not when she saw him every day trying to smile through the pain. Not when she had once held his little hand as he begged her to read him a bedtime story because his father was too busy in meetings to tuck him in. And though Richard was a man of endless wealth, Grace also knew that he had been delaying the surgery, not because of money, but because he feared the risks, because he clung to control in every aspect of life, and this was the one place where he had none. Yet his hesitation was killing his son, and Grace could not take it anymore. So, that night, as the mansion grew quiet and the staff retired to their quarters, she crept back into the office, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might wake the walls themselves, her hands sweaty as she reached for the safe she had seen Richard open countless times, her mind screaming at her to stop, to turn back, to think of the consequences. But then another image flashed before her, the fragile boy with sunken cheeks whispering, "Will I ever get better?" And it silenced every doubt, for what was her life compared to his? What was her freedom compared to a child's chance to live? And so, with fingers shaking, she pressed the code she had memorized from years of quiet observation, the lock, clicking open like a thunderclap in her chest, revealing stacks of money bound in neat rows, the kind of money she could never dream of holding. And for a long moment she froze, staring at it as though it were something forbidden, her breath shallow, her throat dry, the temptation and the terror warring inside her, until at last she reached in and pulled out enough to cover the surgery, stuffing the bundles into a small worn bag she had carried for years, whispering under her breath an apology she hoped the walls might carry to Richard someday, then slipping back out into the night with tears streaming down her face, her body trembling not only with fear of being caught but with the weight of what she had just done. Yet beneath it all, buried deep under the pounding of her heart, was a quiet fire of determination. Because for the first time in her life, she was not serving silently, she was fighting for something that mattered. And, as she walked quickly through the rain toward the hospital, every step felt like a war between right and wrong, between survival and sacrifice. And though she knew the world would see her as nothing more than a thief, she clung to the hope that one day someone might understand that her desperate act was not for greed, but for love. And as the hospital lights finally came into view through the stormy night, she whispered one last promise into the darkness that if this act cost her everything, so be it. As long as Daniel lived. The moment Grace stepped into the hospital lobby with the bag pressed tightly against her chest, the fluorescent lights seemed harsher than ever, and the ticking clock above the reception desk felt like a drum beating down on her every second, for she knew that every heartbeat, every breath, was time slipping away from Daniel. And though her legs were heavy with fear, she forced herself forward, her voice trembling as she asked for the specialist she had heard the doctor mention in the mansion, the one who alone could perform the surgery. And when a nurse pointed her toward the surgical wing, Grace felt her chest tighten, because she had no idea if money alone would be enough, or if the truth of her actions would spill out before she could even explain why she had done it. Yet the thought of Daniel's pale little face kept her moving, her heart racing faster with every step, until she finally found herself in a small office where the surgeon, a tall, weary-eyed man, was reviewing files under a dim lamp. And when Grace stumbled in, dripping rainwater onto the tiled floor, he looked up in surprise, his brow furrowed as though wondering why a maid would be standing before him at such an hour. But before he could speak, Grace dropped the bag on his desk, the bundles of cash spilling out, her hands shaking as she whispered, "Please, save him, save the boy, he does not have much time left." And though her words were urgent, her voice cracked under the weight of fear, because what if the doctor refused? What if he asked where she had gotten the money? What if the police were called before she could make him understand? Yet instead of anger, the doctor leaned forward, his sharp eyes softening with something that almost looked like pity, as if he could see the desperation written in every line of her face. And after a long silence that made her heart pound against her ribs like a prisoner begging to be freed, he said, "We can prepare him for surgery tonight, but this money does not explain how you came by it." And Grace, swallowing the lump in her throat, forced the words out, "I took it from his father. He would never agree. He is afraid, but I could not let the boy die." And once the confession escaped her lips, the room felt colder, as if the truth had stripped away every layer of protection she had. But the doctor did not call for guards, nor did he scold her. Instead, he sighed, rubbing his temples as though he too had battled with Richard's stubborn refusal, then finally nodded and said, "If you are willing to take the risk, I will do it." And with that, the race truly began. Nurses rushing through the corridors, papers shuffled, instruments prepared, and Grace, who had always felt invisible in the grand mansion, now stood in the middle of chaos, watching strangers move quickly to save a boy who had once whispered his dreams to her when no one else cared to listen. Yet, as the hours dragged on and she sat in the waiting area, her fingers tightly clasped, her mind was torn apart by two storms: one of hope, that Daniel might open his eyes stronger than before, and one of terror, that Richard would discover the theft before morning and destroy her life forever. And with every sound of footsteps echoing in the hallways, she imagined police officers coming to take her away, imagined the shame of being branded a thief, and though her chest ached with the weight of what she had done, she reminded herself again and again that it was worth it if Daniel lived. Worth it if one day he could run again under the sunlight, instead of being trapped in a bed. And as the red light above the operating room door flickered on and off, her entire world seemed to hang in the balance, the ticking clock louder than ever, until at last the surgeon emerged, his mask pulled down, sweat beading his forehead, his expression unreadable, and Grace felt her breath stop as she whispered, "Please, tell me," her heart beating so fast she thought it might burst. And though the truth of his words would change everything, she knew she had to hear it. For this was the moment when love and sacrifice collided with fate, and there would be no turning back. The early rays of morning light crept into the mansion as Richard returned home earlier than expected. His mind heavy after another restless night spent pacing outside the hospital where he had finally dozed off in his car, convinced that his son's condition was worsening, with no hope left. But as he stepped into the grand hallway, the silence felt unusual, almost too heavy, and when he passed by his study, his sharp eyes froze at the sight of the half-open safe door, something that had never happened before, and his pulse quickened as he walked closer, noticing stacks of money missing, the neat bundles gone, as though someone had ripped away a piece of his life. And with his heart racing in anger and fear, Richard clenched his fists, his mind already searching for answers. But the face that came to him first was Grace's, the quiet maid who had always moved like a shadow in his house, never speaking much but always watching his son with a tenderness that sometimes unsettled him. And as his suspicion grew, he rushed to the hospital again, storming through the corridors, demanding to know where his boy was, and to his shock, the nurses told him Daniel had already been taken into surgery hours ago. The words striking him like thunder because he had never given such an order. He had never approved it, yet when the doctor appeared, his calm voice said, "Your son is in good hands. The surgery has already begun," and Richard's mind reeled, confusion mixing with rage, as he demanded, "Who authorized this? Who paid for this?" And though the doctor hesitated, his eyes glanced toward Grace, who sat nervously in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly as though praying. And in that one glance, Richard understood, the truth exploding in his chest, and he marched toward her, his footsteps echoing with fury, his voice like fire as he demanded, "What did you do?" And Grace, trembling but refusing to hide, rose to her feet, her lips quivering as she whispered, "I did what you were too afraid to do. I gave him a chance to live." And her words, though soft, cut through him sharper than a blade, because deep down he knew she was right. Deep down he had let his fear of losing Daniel keep him from trying, but his pride would not allow him to admit it. Not yet. And so he shouted, "You stole from me. You betrayed me. Do you have any idea what this means?" And the waiting room grew silent, nurses pausing in their steps, patients glancing at them, and Grace, though tears shimmered in her eyes, stood firm, saying, "It means that your son might live. It means that sometimes love requires courage, even if it means breaking the rules." And for a moment, Richard had no words. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the woman he had once dismissed as nothing more than a servant, now standing before him with more strength than he could bear to see. And though he wanted to drag her out, to call the police, to reclaim his stolen pride, he found himself frozen. Because at that very moment the operating room doors opened, the surgeon stepping out, his weary face breaking into a tired but relieved smile as he said, "The boy made it through. The surgery was a success. He has a real chance now." And those words hit Richard harder than any argument could, his knees almost buckling as relief surged through him, his anger burning away in the face of the one thing he had longed for: hope. Yet at the same time, shame gripped his heart, because the life of his son had been saved, not by his wealth or power, but by the courage of a maid he had overlooked. And as he stood there in silence, torn between gratitude and pride, his eyes met Grace's, and in them he saw no victory, no defiance, only exhaustion and a desperate prayer that Daniel would wake up smiling again. And in that instant, Richard felt something shift within him, though he could not yet admit it. could not yet say the words he knew were forming in his heart. For now all he could do was wait, stand in the shadows of the recovery room, watching his son breathe steadily. Each breath a reminder of the risk Grace had taken, and each breath a question that haunted him. What would he do now? Forgive the act that had saved his child, or punish the woman who had dared to cross the line? The hours that followed felt like a storm trapped inside Richard's chest. The relief of seeing his son alive, clashing with the fury of betrayal, and though Daniel rested peacefully in the recovery room, machines softly humming beside him, Richard's gaze kept drifting toward Grace, who sat alone on a bench outside, her face pale, her eyes red from tears, her hands still trembling. And every time he looked at her, he felt torn between wanting to thank her and wanting to demand answers until his anger consumed him. And as the night deepened, when the hospital hallways grew quiet, Richard finally stepped outside where she sat, his heavy footsteps making her lift her head slowly, her eyes meeting his with fear but also a strange calmness, as though she had already prepared herself for whatever storm he was about to unleash. And his voice, low but sharp, broke the silence as he asked, "Why, Grace? Why would you risk everything? Your job, your freedom, even your life, to take what was not yours?" And though she looked away at first, staring down at her worn shoes, she finally whispered, "Because I couldn't stand by and watch a child die when I knew I could help, even if it meant losing everything." And her words, though simple, struck Richard like a stone, for he had built his life around rules, control, and order. Yet here stood a woman who had broken all those rules for the sake of love and courage. And as he struggled to speak, anger flaring up again, he shouted, "You had no right. Do you understand what could have happened if the surgery failed? If he had died? You would have carried that blood on your hands forever." And his voice echoed down the hallway, making a nurse glance over before quickly walking away. But Grace did not flinch, her voice steady, though her body trembled. "And if I had done nothing, if I had stood in silence while you hesitated, then I would have carried that guilt forever, and I couldn't live with that. Not when I saw the pain in his eyes every day. Not when I heard him call for you in his sleep, while you hid your fear behind walls of pride." And her words cut deeper than any blade, because Richard knew she was speaking the truth he had buried deep inside himself. The truth that he had been too afraid to take the risk, too afraid to lose his son in a failed surgery. So he had done nothing, and in that nothingness, he had almost lost him anyway. And his voice faltered as he whispered, "You stole from me, Grace. You took what wasn't yours." But before he could say more, Grace lifted her tear-stained face, her voice quiet yet filled with a strength he had never noticed before. "I didn't take it for myself, Mr. Hale. I took it for him, because no child deserves to die when there is hope. And if that makes me a thief in your eyes, then so be it. I will carry that name. But at least I will know I tried to save him when no one else did." And silence fell between them, heavy and sharp. Richard pacing back and forth, his fists clenching and unclenching, his pride demanding he call the police, his heart begging him to thank her, and the war inside him nearly tore him apart, until at last he stopped, turning toward her with a face torn between rage and sorrow. And he asked in a broken whisper, "Do you know what you've done to me? You've shown me that all my wealth, all my power, meant nothing when I didn't have the courage to act. And you, someone I overlooked, someone I never truly saw, had more strength than I could ever admit." And Grace's tears spilled freely. Then, her shoulders shaking as she bowed her head, whispering, "I never wanted to hurt you. I only wanted to save him." And Richard stood there in silence, his heart pounding, his throat tight, his eyes drifting back to the window where Daniel lay asleep, alive, breathing. And for the first time in years, he felt something break inside him, something he had kept locked away. And though he could not yet forgive, could not yet embrace the act that had shaken his world, he found himself unable to condemn her either. And so, with a voice quieter than before, he said, "We will talk. When he wakes, when I see him open his eyes again, only then will I know what to do with you." And with that, he walked away, leaving Grace sitting in the dim hallway, her heart heavy but steady, knowing that whatever punishment awaited her, she had done what she believed was right. And as the night grew darker, both of them sat in different corners of the hospital, waiting, wondering, fearing what tomorrow would bring, their lives forever changed by a choice that could not be undone. Morning sunlight crept through the tall glass windows of the hospital, casting golden streaks on the cold white floor. And as the city outside woke to the sound of traffic and rushing footsteps, Richard Hale sat by his son's bedside, his hand resting gently over the boy's small fingers, his eyes heavy from a night without sleep. And though Daniel's face was pale, it carried the peace of survival. Each rise and fall of his chest a silent victory against the storm that had nearly claimed him. And as Richard stared, lost between gratitude and guilt, he heard the faint stir of movement as Daniel's eyelids fluttered open, the boy's weak voice whispering, "Dad." And in that single word, Richard felt his world collapse and rebuild at once, his heart breaking with relief as tears filled his eyes. And he leaned closer, whispering back, "I'm here, son, I'm right here." And for a long moment, he forgot about Grace, forgot about betrayal and pride, until his son's small voice, strained but steady, asked, "Did she help me, Dad? Grace, did she save me?" And the weight of those words pressed on Richard's chest. For he had hoped Daniel would not know, hoped he could keep the story hidden. But the boy's gaze was too innocent, too honest, and Richard could not lie. So with a trembling breath, he nodded, saying softly, "Yes, she helped you. She made sure you got the surgery you needed." And Daniel's lips curved into the faintest smile before he whispered, "Then she's my hero." And with that, his eyes closed again, drifting back into sleep, leaving Richard stunned, for the words of a child carried more weight than all his wealth and wisdom. And in that moment, the decision he had fought with through the night began to take shape, though it terrified him, though it defied every rule he had lived by. And when the doctors confirmed Daniel's steady recovery hours later, Richard finally rose, his steps slow, his heart pounding, as he walked down the corridor toward the waiting area where Grace sat hunched, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes swollen from tears, and when she saw him approach, she stood quickly, bracing herself for the worst, ready for punishment, ready for judgment. But instead of anger, his voice carried a calm she did not expect as he said, "He woke up, Grace, and the first thing he did was call you his hero." And the word struck her like lightning, tears instantly welling as her lips parted in shock. But before she could speak, Richard continued, "I should hate you for what you did. I should call the police. I should make an example of you for breaking my trust. Yet how can I punish the one person who saved my son when I could not? How can I condemn the courage that gave him a chance to live?" And his voice cracked with emotion, his chest tightening as years of pride shattered. In that single confession, and Grace, trembling, whispered, "I never wanted anything for myself. I only wanted to save him." And her voice, though weak, carried the same fire it had the night before. And Richard, for the first time in his life, bowed his head to someone he had once considered beneath him, whispering, "Then let me give you what you never asked for, freedom, a new life, a chance to live without fear." And Grace gasped, her eyes widening as he continued, "I will not punish you, Grace, but I will not forget what you did either. For you have shown me more than any business partner, any rival, any advisor ever could. You showed me that wealth means nothing without courage, that love is greater than pride." And as his words settled, Grace's tears flowed freely, her knees nearly giving way. But Richard caught her arm gently, steadying her, and in that touch there was no anger, no division, only a fragile respect that had been born from fire. And though whispers of hospital staff followed them, though the world outside would one day question his mercy, Richard knew the decision was his alone, and he had chosen not punishment, not revenge, but gratitude. And as they both walked back toward Daniel's room, silent but bound by the same heartbeat of relief, the billionaire who once thought himself untouchable and the maid who had once feared every misstep now stood side by side, their lives forever changed, their souls forever marked by a desperate act of love that had rewritten the meaning of power. And in that quiet morning, beneath the hum of hospital machines and the faint sound of a child's breathing, Richard made a vow he had never spoken before, not to wealth, not to pride, but to his son, to Grace, and to a life where courage would never again be overlooked. And as the sun rose higher, its light filled the room, carrying with it the silent promise that sometimes the most unexpected decisions are the ones that save not only a life, but a soul.